Blaise King was 41 years old, 6 feet 2, and had spent the better part of his adult life believing that a quiet man who worked hard and loved deeply would always be enough. He was wrong. On the night of December 20th, in a ballroom filled with 300 guests, crystal champagne flutes, and the kind of laughter that echoes off marble floors, his wife of 18 years handed her 28-year-old executive assistant a $14,000 Rolex Daytona, the exact watch Blaise had once quietly pointed to in a catalog and said, "Someday." Then she turned and handed her husband a pair of drugstore socks, price tag still on, $6.99. But here's what nobody in that room understood yet. Blaise King was not surprised. The faint smile that crossed his face in that moment wasn't grief. It wasn't humiliation. It was recognition. Because Blaise had been quietly preparing for exactly this for 16 months. Atlanta in December has a particular kind of cold. Not brutal like Chicago, not dramatic like New York. It sneaks up on you. It feels almost warm until you realize you've been standing outside too long and your hands have gone completely numb. That's the best way to describe what happened to Blaise King's marriage. The Lowe's Atlanta Hotel on Peachtree Street stood lit up like a lantern that night. Valet attendants moved through the entrance in crisp black jackets. A string quartet played something soft and jazzy near the grand staircase. The smell of cedar and pine garland drifted through the lobby. Blaise arrived 10 minutes early, as he always did. He wore a charcoal gray suit, nothing flashy, nothing cheap. The kind a man chooses when he wants to look like he belongs without needing anyone to say so. He straightened his tie in the elevator mirror, smoothed a hand over his close-cut hair, and drew a long, quiet breath. 300 people were waiting inside that ballroom. His wife's people, her investors, her board members, the journalists who had written glowing profiles about Zara King, the visionary CEO of Eclipse Health Tech, the woman who had built a health technology company from a garage in the old Fourth Ward into a firm valued at over $90 million. Blaise had designed the original pitch deck. He had hosted the first investors in their kitchen. He had kept their daughter Zuri fed and bathed and tucked in at night, while Zara worked until 2 in the morning. But none of that was in the profiles. He slipped into the ballroom and took his usual position, slightly to the left near the edge of the room, close enough to be present, far enough to be invisible. That had become his geography at these events over the past few years. A little further from center each time. A little further from her. The room was beautiful. Round tables draped in ivory linen, gold candlesticks, winter florals in deep burgundy and cream. The kind of room that made people feel successful simply by breathing the air inside it. Then Zara appeared. She walked in wearing a strapless black gown and moved through the crowd the way a woman moves when she has completely forgotten what uncertainty feels like. She kissed cheeks. She laughed at the right moments. She made every person she spoke to feel like the most important person in the building. Blaise watched her from across the room and felt something shift quietly inside his chest. Not jealousy, not longing. Something colder and more final than either of those things. He recognized her brilliance. He always had. He just no longer recognized her heart. The evening moved along. Speeches were made, awards were given. Blaise spoke politely to the people beside him, laughed when appropriate, held his champagne flute without drinking much. Then Zara called the room to attention. She spoke warmly about gratitude, about excellence, about the team that had built something extraordinary together. People applauded. Several wiped their eyes. Then she reached for a sleek navy gift box from the table behind her and walked it directly to Nasir Reeves. 28 years old, her executive assistant, a young man who wore his ambition the way some people wear cologne, applied too heavily, noticed immediately. Nasir opened the box. The Rolex Daytona caught the light, and sent a ripple of quiet gasps through the nearest tables. Then Zara turned toward her husband. She held out a small package wrapped in cheap drugstore paper, the kind sold near the checkout register, between lip balm and travel-size hand lotion. Blaise opened it slowly. Gray fabric socks. $6.99. The clearance sticker still attached. Several guests looked away. Zara leaned close and whispered against his ear. "You know why, don't you?" There was no guilt in her eyes, no anger. Only the icy certainty of someone who had been carrying this moment for a very long time. Blaise stood perfectly still. Then he closed his hand around those socks, gently, deliberately, and offered the faintest possible smile. Because in that moment, he had everything he needed. Not the watch, the confirmation. What Zara didn't know, what she couldn't have known, is that her husband had been quietly building something of his own for 16 months. And what he had prepared was about to change everything. If your partner publicly humiliated you the way Zara humiliated Blaise, would you leave in silence like he did? Or would you respond right then and there? Type 1 if you'd walk away quietly. Type 2 if you'd say something. Or share your story in the comments. I read every single one. To understand what Blaise King did next, you first have to understand who he was before that night, stripped everything down to the bone. This is not a story about a weak man who is blindsided. This is a story about a strong man who loved too quietly and trusted too long, and who finally, at last, stopped. Blaise and Zara first met in the spring of 2010 at a business conference held at the Georgia World Congress Center in downtown Atlanta. He was 25 and freshly licensed as an architect. She was 23, carrying a business plan under her arm and a confidence that filled whatever room she walked into. They were both early to the same morning panel. They both reached for the last decent cup of coffee at the same moment. She laughed. He stepped back and said, "Please, you look like you need it more than I do." She told him later that was the exact moment she knew. They married 2 years after that, in a small ceremony at Cascade Springs Nature Preserve on the west side of Atlanta. Nothing extravagant, just their families, the light through the trees, and two people who believed they were building something together. For a while, they were. Eclipse Health Tech started in the garage of their rental home in the old Fourth Ward neighborhood. Blaise cut back his architectural clients to give the startup his full attention. He designed the pitch materials. He helped build the early financial models. He sat across from nervous investors in their own living room and made them feel at ease, while Zara made them feel inspired. When their daughter Zuri was born in 2013, Blaise restructured his entire professional schedule around her. He handled school pickups, pediatric appointments, Saturday morning pancakes. He was the one Zuri crawled into bed with during thunderstorms. He never resented any of it, not in those years, because Zara still saw him then. She would come home late and exhausted and find the kitchen clean and Zuri asleep and Blaise waiting with something warm on the stove, and she would look at him with a softness that made all of it feel worthwhile. But success does strange things to people. It doesn't always corrupt them loudly. Sometimes it just quietly rearranges their priorities until you can't recognize the order anymore. By 2019, Eclipse Health Tech had surpassed 50 employees and secured its first major hospital network contract. By 2021, the company had grown past 300 staff. Zara's name appeared in the Atlanta Business Chronicle, Black Enterprise, and Forbes. She was photographed at galas, invited to speak at national conferences, held up as a model of what was possible. Blaise stood at the edges of all of it, steady as a wall. But walls don't get thanked, they just get leaned on. The conversations between them grew thinner. Zara began coming to bed later and later. On the nights she did come, she turned away before he could speak. She smiled privately at her phone. She bought expensive perfume and didn't mention it. She became cold in the particular way that has no explosion and no explanation, just a gradual, terrible withdrawal. Blaise told himself it was the pressure of running a company that size. He had watched her build something extraordinary, and he chose, again and again, to believe the woman he married was still inside all of that. He kept choosing that, right up until the night of December 19th, when Zara's phone buzzed on the dining room table at 3:14 in the morning. He wasn't looking for anything. He was half awake, and the phone was buzzing, and it was right there. He turned it over out of reflex. The message was from Nasir. "Tonight was everything. You handled it perfectly. I can't wait until you're finally done with him." Blaise set the phone down. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he said it aloud, quietly, to no one, to the empty kitchen, to 18 years of a life he had built with his hands and his silence. "My wife," he said. Just those 2 words. Nothing after them. Blaise read it once, then again. Then he set the phone back down, face up this time, and sat very still in the dark kitchen of the home he had helped build and maintain for 18 years. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. He sat with the particular stillness of a man whose worst suspicion has just been confirmed, not as a shock, but as a quiet, devastating arrival at a truth he had been circling for a long time. He got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table while the refrigerator hummed and the house slept around him. Then he opened the drawer where he kept his files. Because Blaise King had not been entirely idle. 16 months earlier, long before he had concrete proof, driven by nothing more than the instinct of a man who had stopped being truly seen, he had begun keeping records. Bank statements flagging large, unexplained cash withdrawals. Hotel reservation confirmations for suite bookings at the Intercontinental Buckhead on dates that aligned, he now recognized, with Zara's claimed overnight business trips. Company credit card records he had obtained through a financial review he had framed as a routine audit. The total across 18 months was just under $15,000. Gifts, private dinners at Bones Restaurant on Piedmont Road, a weekend in Savannah at the Perry Lane Hotel, all of it pointing in the same direction. He had gathered it without certainty, because something in his nature understood that a man who stops being seen in his own home must protect himself, not out of bitterness, out of self-respect. More than a year ago, before he had a single piece of confirmed evidence, Blaise had written a handwritten letter on heavy linen paper. Calm, precise, every suspicion documented, every copied record attached. He had sealed the envelope and tucked it away and genuinely hoped he would never need to use it. Tonight, he understood that he did. He finished his coffee, washed his mug and set it in the rack. He looked around the kitchen. The pendant light Zara had picked out, the backsplash tiles he had installed himself one long Saturday in October, the drawing Zuri had made in 2nd grade, still held to the refrigerator by a strawberry magnet. He stood there for a moment, breathing it all in. Then he climbed the stairs, checked on Zuri, watched her sleep for just a minute, and walked back down. He had already decided what came next. It had nothing to do with anger. It had everything to do with the kind of quiet, earned self-respect that does not ask anyone's permission. Zara had once told him, back in the early years when they still told each other everything, that in both business and marriage, the person who fails to prepare is the person who loses. She had taught him that lesson herself. He had never forgotten it. And what Blaise did before sunrise that morning, and who he reached out to the moment he left, is the part that no one in that house could have seen coming. At 4:57 in the morning on December 21st, Blaise King walked through the front door of the house on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard. pulled it shut behind him with a quiet click, and didn't look back. One duffel bag, his late father's watch in the center console, the sealed envelope placed beneath the Christmas tree, exactly where Zara had handed him those socks just hours earlier. He drove north on I-985 toward the mountains and the lake beyond them. No music, no phone calls, just the dark highway and the first pale gray of a winter morning pulling at the edge of the sky. Now, if we step outside the story for a moment and observe what is actually happening here, there is something important that is easy to miss if you're only watching the surface. Blaise did not leave in anger. He left in clarity. Psychologists who study long-term betrayal in marriage describe what they call the final straw moment, the point at which a patient, accommodating partner reaches what researchers call emotional detachment completion. It is not an explosion. It is the opposite. It is the quiet, internal closing of a door that has been swinging slowly shut for a very long time. The public humiliation at the party was not what broke Blaise. It was simply the moment he stopped pretending that what he already knew was not true. This distinction matters enormously, because it is why he was prepared. A man who is merely reacting does not have a sealed envelope ready. A man in genuine clarity does. He reached Lake Lanier just before sunrise and let himself into the cabin. 3 rooms, a wood stove, a screened porch facing the water. A property held in his name alone, purchased before the company's finances had grown complicated. Zara had visited it exactly once, early in their marriage, and called it sweet but kind of middle of nowhere, which was, as Blaise always understood, precisely the point. Before he crossed the bridge, he had stopped briefly in a parking lot off Buford Drive and sent a single folder of photographs, hotel records, time-stamped documentation, to a contact saved under the initials A.R., Amina Reeves, Nazir's wife, a pediatric physical therapist who worked near Northside Hospital on Johnson Ferry Road in Sandy Springs. Blaise had met her once at a company dinner, and she had shaken his hand with the steady directness of someone who performs for no one. He had kept her number for 6 months, not with a plan, but because the same methodical instinct that had made him keep records told him she deserved to know what he was beginning to understand. He sent the folder, put the phone face down, drove the rest of the way in silence. What he could not have anticipated was this. Amina Reeves had not been waiting for anyone to bring her the truth. She had already been building it herself. They met 3 days later at a small cafe on Church Street in Evanston, far enough from Atlanta that neither would be recognized. Amina was already seated at a corner table with a cup of tea and a closed notebook when Blaise arrived. He sat down across from her, and they looked at each other, with the wordless recognition of 2 people who have been carrying the same weight from opposite ends of the same rope. "How long have you known?" Blaise asked. "Long enough," Amina said. "You?" 16 months of suspicion. 1 night of confirmation. He paused. "My wife sent her assistant a $14,000 watch at the company Christmas party, in front of 300 people. Then handed me drugstore socks." Amina held his gaze without flinching. "I found hotel reservations last spring. I kept hoping I'd misread something." "I did the same," Blaise said. "Longer than I'm proud of." A pause settled between them. "I have what I need," Amina said. "I just needed to know it wasn't only once. That I hadn't misread the whole thing." "You didn't," Blaise told her. She looked out the window briefly, then back at him. Her eyes were dry and steady, the way eyes get when someone has finished all the private crying and arrived somewhere past it. "Neither did you," she said. Here is the layer worth examining closely. When Blaise reached out to Amina, he was not acting out of spite. He was doing something that trauma-informed therapists call breaking the conspiracy of silence. Affairs survive on separation, They depend on the two betrayed partners never connecting, because as long as that separation holds, the people doing the deceiving maintain all the information and therefore all the power. The moment Blaise sent that folder, he didn't merely share evidence, he dismantled the architecture of concealment that had kept both of them isolated and uninformed. This is not revenge, it is the restoration of truth to the people it rightfully belonged to. There is another layer here worth naming. Both Blaise and Amina had known for months. Both had made excuses. Both had delayed. Relationship psychologists describe this as traumatic bonding inertia, the way long-term partners unconsciously resist confirming a truth they already sense, because confirmation demands action, and action means loss. Even the loss of something painful is still loss. But here is what separates them from people who never leave. They prepared while they hoped. They didn't simply endure. They documented quietly, organized carefully, and built their exit with their own hands before they felt ready to walk through it. Victims wait to be rescued. Survivors build the door. They talked for nearly 2 hours, not with bitterness, but with the focused calm of two intelligent, wounded people who had decided to be practical, sharing timelines, cross-referencing records, establishing what each could document before attorneys were called. It was not comfortable, but it was necessary. And somewhere in the middle of it, Blaise noticed something. This woman had handled something devastating with more composure than most people bring to a minor setback. She had not collapsed. She had simply, quietly, prepared. He found that steadying in a way he hadn't expected. Back in Atlanta, things were already unraveling. Amina filed for divorce on the morning of January 3rd. Nasir Reeves was served the papers not at home, not in private, but during Eclipse Health Tech's weekly staff meeting, in the conference room on the 14th floor of the Midtown office building on West Peachtree Street, directly in front of Zara and more than 20 employees. The process server walked in, confirmed his name, placed the envelope on the table, and walked back out without a word. 4 seconds of absolute silence. Then the murmuring began. Whatever composed confidence Nasir had always projected evaporated in real time. He looked at Zahra with the desperation of someone reaching for a life preserver that had already floated out of reach. Zahra looked away. That same afternoon, a video recorded during a company retreat at a resort in Amelia Island, Florida, showing Zahra and Nasir in circumstances that left no room for interpretation, was forwarded anonymously to nearly every senior inbox in the company. Within 40 minutes, it had spread to the general staff channel. Nasir came apart in the hallway, publicly, visibly, in front of colleagues who had respected him an hour earlier. He said far too much about what they had shared, what she had promised, what she had spent on him. Every word landed in front of witnesses. Zahra's response was swift and cold. She issued a statement calling him a liability and positioned herself as the victim of a professional manipulation. She said it without blinking. And here, from a behavioral standpoint, Zahra made the most consequential error of her entire unraveling. When a person responds to exposure not with accountability, but with immediate deflection, sacrificing their accomplice to protect themselves, they don't contain the damage. They reveal something far more damaging than the original wrongdoing. They reveal character. People can recover professionally from serious mistakes when they demonstrate genuine accountability and changed behavior. What people do not recover from, in business, in leadership, in any relationship built on trust, is being seen as someone willing to destroy another person the moment that person becomes inconvenient. 300 employees had just watched their CEO do exactly that. The internal investigation launched that Friday was not a surprise. It was inevitable. And what those investigators uncovered inside Zahra's own financial records, and what it cost her in a single board meeting 18 days later, is the part of this story that absolutely no one saw coming. There is a particular silence that fills a boardroom when something irrevocable is about to happen. Not the silence of people thinking, not the silence of people waiting, the silence of people who already know, who have known since they walked through the door, and are simply watching the last few seconds count down on a clock that can't be stopped. That was the silence inside the 42nd floor conference room of a Buckhead office tower on January 8th, when Zara King sat down at the head of the mahogany table she had once believed would always be hers. She wore black. She had prepared remarks. She still believed, right up until the first slide appeared on the screen, that she could manage this. She was wrong. Before we follow what happens in that room, it's worth stepping back and naming what we are actually watching. Because it would be easy to frame Zara's collapse as simple consequence. A betrayal exposed, a punishment delivered, the ledger balanced. But that framing is too thin to be useful. What is unfolding here is something behavioral researchers call the catastrophic convergence of unchecked success and emotional insulation. And it is worth understanding. Not to excuse what Zara did, but because this pattern does not only happen in marriages. It happens in families, in friendships, in workplaces, wherever one person's achievements begin to separate them from the ordinary consequences that keep the rest of us honest. Rapid, sustained success, when it arrives without adequate self-awareness, creates a particular kind of danger. Not a dramatic moral collapse, but a slow drift. A person begins to operate inside a world where rules feel negotiable, where consequences feel like things that happen to less capable people, and where the steady, reliable people around them begin to feel like fixtures rather than human beings with their own limits and worth. Zara did not wake up one morning and decide to dismantle her marriage. She drifted into it, through 1,000 small choices, over years, to prioritize her own need for stimulation and validation above her husband's dignity. And because Blaise was steady and uncomplaining, those choices never triggered any alarm. He absorbed them silently. Until he didn't. The investigators had been thorough. 47 pages, documented and time-stamped. The findings were not ambiguous. Zara had personally approved nearly all of Nasir's personal expenses through company accounts. Spa weekends, fine jewelry, a 3-night stay at the Montage Palmetto Bluff in Bluffton, South Carolina, a first-class flight to Miami for a conference he never attended. She had originated many of the approvals herself, routing charges through discretionary budget lines with minimal oversight. In at least 4 documented cases, she had applied false project codes to his expense reports. Company funds misused, just over $63,000. And that was only what could be directly traced. The board's attorney looked across the mahogany table and spoke with the measured calm of someone who has delivered this kind of news before. Ms. King. The board is prepared to accept your voluntary resignation, effective immediately, in exchange for a structured agreement limiting further legal action. Should you decline, the board will move to remove you by vote, which the current proxy count will support. Zara looked around the table. She had known some of these people for a decade. She had hired 2 of them herself. Not one of them met her eyes. She signed the resignation letter at 11:47 in the morning. Her equity stake was diluted to a position that held little meaningful value. Her severance was made conditional on continued cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Her name was removed from the company website before end of business. The woman who had built Eclipse Health Tech from a garage in the old 4th Ward walked out of that building without a title, without a company, and without a single ally willing to walk alongside her. The months that followed were quiet and brutal, in the way that private collapse tends to be. Blaise's attorneys, working through the divorce proceedings, uncovered the full financial picture. More than $280,000 in marital assets had been quietly redirected over the previous 2 years, drawn from joint accounts investment funds, and a home equity line of credit on the old Fourth Ward property. Transferred in portions to accounts that Nasir controlled or that Zara had opened without Blaise's knowledge. When Zara later explained it to Blaise directly, she used these words: "He needed me. He made me feel like I was the center of his universe." Blaise's response was quiet and exact. "He needed what you could give him. That's not the same as needing you." This is the distinction worth sitting with. What Zara had experienced with Nasir was not love. It was something psychologists call validation dependency, a pattern in which a person, often one who has achieved significant external success, develops an intense need for a very specific kind of admiration that a long-term partner can no longer easily provide. Here is why this happens. In the early years of any relationship, everything is performed. Attention is deliberate. Admiration is expressed. Partners show up for each other with conscious effort. But over time, in healthy relationships, that performance settles into something deeper and quieter. The steady, abiding presence of two people who no longer need to perform because they genuinely know each other. For certain people, that shift feels like loss. The quiet starts to feel like indifference. The reliability starts to feel like invisibility. And when someone new appears, younger, unencumbered, intensely focused on making them feel extraordinary, the contrast is almost chemically powerful. Nasir didn't love Zara. He recognized a need in a powerful woman and filled it with extraordinary precision. He was a mirror, positioned to reflect back her most flattering image. And Zara, who had built a company, who had everything, who should have been satisfied, mistook that reflection for something real. She traded an 18-year investment in a man of genuine character for an imitation of being seen. And she didn't realize it was an imitation until everything real was already gone. The house on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard went to foreclosure 4 months after Zara's resignation, when mortgage payments, drawn from the joint account she had been slowly draining, finally collapsed under the deficit she had created. By April, she was living in a one-bedroom apartment off Memorial Drive on the east side of Atlanta. One car, her clothes, a phone with a cracked screen she hadn't replaced because replacing it felt like admitting something she still wasn't fully ready to admit. She drove to the Lake Lanier cabin on a Thursday afternoon in late April. She hadn't called ahead. She wasn't sure he'd answer if she did. She parked on the gravel lane and sat in the car for several minutes, looking at the screened porch, the smoke curling from the chimney, the late afternoon light spreading gold across the water through the trees. She looked diminished, not in height, not in the architecture of her face, in the way a person looks when the confidence they built around themselves has been stripped away, and the foundation underneath it was never fully developed. Blaise came to the door. He stood on the porch steps, hands in his pockets, and waited. She walked toward him and stopped at the bottom step. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was rough, in the way of someone who had been crying for weeks. "I know," Blaise said. "I lost everything." "I know that too." A long silence stretched between them. Then she told him about the money, the full amount, all of it, and Blaise listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her with no cruelty and no warmth. Only the plain, weathered honesty of a man who had carried a heavy thing for a very long time and had finally, at last, set it down. "He needed what you could give him," Blaise said again, quietly. "That is not the same as needing you. I hope someday you understand the difference." He paused. "I did, for 18 years. Zara pressed her eyes shut. And then, from inside the cabin, came the sound of small footsteps on hardwood, the soft creak of the screen door. Zuri stepped onto the porch. 11 years old, socks, an oversized sweatshirt, a stillness on her face that had no business belonging to a child. She walked down the steps without a word and put both arms around her father's waist. Then she looked at her mother and said it the way children say the truest things, without performance, without drama, with the devastating simplicity of someone who has already decided and is only now saying it aloud. Mom, I heard everything. For months. You stopped seeing Dad. I don't want to live with you. I choose Dad. Here is what child development experts consistently find in families shaped by long-term parental absence, emotional or physical, and eventual betrayal. Children do not process these situations the way adults do. Adults contextualize. Adults find language for complexity. Children experience it in the body, in the tension at the dinner table that no one addresses, in the parent who is physically present but emotionally somewhere else, in the other parent who is always there, always steady, always the one who comes when called. Zuri had been keeping an honest account, not out of calculation, but the way a child's nervous system simply records what it lives inside. She had chosen her father long before she said it aloud. She was only now giving words to something she had known for years. This is the cost that never makes the headlines. Not the boardroom, not the balance sheet, not the industry reputation. The look on a child's face when she understands that one of the two people who was supposed to always see her stopped looking. Zahra sank to the gravel at the base of the porch steps and wept in a way she had not wept since she was a child herself. And Blaise stood above her, not triumphant, not cold, not vindicated, just still, holding his daughter, bearing witness to the full, true cost of the choice she had made. What Blaise said to her before they parted for the very last time, and the life he quietly, deliberately built from the rubble of everything they had lost, is exactly where this story goes next. Blaise did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. A marriage had ended, a family had fractured, an 11-year-old girl had been forced to say something no child should ever have to say to her mother, and the sound of those words would live in all three of them for the rest of their lives. Blaise understood that. He sat with it fully, without dressing it up into something cleaner than it was. He had always known the difference between justice and joy. What had happened at that cabin was the former, painful and necessary, and, in the way that true things sometimes are, irrevocable. But it was not joy. Not yet. Zahra stayed that evening. Not inside. She did not ask to come in, and Blaise did not offer. But she sat on the bottom porch step for a long while as the sun finished its work over the lake. And Blaise sat on the step above her, and they talked. Really talked. Perhaps for the first time in years. Not with bitterness. Not with the chaotic energy of people in the middle of a crisis. With the exhausted honesty of two people who had nothing left to protect. She told him how the attention from Nasir had started small and felt harmless, and then became something she couldn't stop feeding. How success had made her feel invincible until, almost imperceptibly, it had made her feel untouchable. Not just professionally, but in her personal relationships too. How she had looked at Blaise, steady, patient, always present, and told herself that his reliability meant she didn't need to tend to it. That a strong marriage, like a sturdy house, would simply continue to stand without maintenance. Right up until the moment it didn't. I told myself you didn't need my attention, she said. You always seemed so fine. I was fine because I was carrying both our halves, Blaise said. That's not the same thing. She was quiet for a long moment. Do you hate me? He considered the question honestly. I did, for a little while. He looked out at the water. My wife had been planning that moment for a long time. The socks, the watch, the whisper. She wanted me to feel small in front of everyone. A pause. It didn't work. But yes, in those first nights here, alone, I hated her for trying. Then what do you feel now? He looked out at the water. Sad, he said. Sad that we let it get this far. Sad for Zuri. Sad for who we were before you stopped seeing me. That version of us deserved better than what we gave it. She wept quietly. He let her. Before she left, she stood and faced him one last time. Blaise looked at her directly, without cruelty, without warmth, with the plain irreversibility of a man who has finally stopped carrying something that was never his to carry alone. You chose to stop seeing my value, he said. Now you have to live with that choice. A pause. I hope you find your way, Zara. I mean that. But I won't be part of that journey. She nodded once, walked to her car, drove away down the gravel lane. Blaise stood on the porch until her taillights disappeared around the bend. Then he turned and went inside. And he sat with Zuri at the kitchen table. And they ate leftover soup and talked about the book she was reading and the kind of trees she had spotted on the trail that afternoon. Small things, normal things. The exact texture of a life that is real and present and fully inhabited. He understood, sitting at that table, that this was what he had been missing most. The divorce was finalized in August. Blaise's attorneys had worked carefully. The financial protections he had arranged years earlier, the cabin held in a separate trust, the independent retirement accounts, the consulting contracts maintained under his own LLC throughout the marriage, had been structured with enough foresight to preserve a meaningful foundation for what came next. He didn't come out wealthy, but he came out whole. He recognized that as the more valuable outcome. In the months after the divorce, Blaise quietly reopened his architectural consulting practice under a new name in a converted studio space on North Highland Avenue in Atlanta's Virginia Highland neighborhood. High ceilings, exposed brick, tall windows that let the morning light in at an angle that made the work feel like more than a transaction. He took on residential projects first, a home renovation in Decatur, a small commercial build in East Atlanta Village. Steady, deliberate work that reminded him why he had chosen this profession. The genuine satisfaction of designing spaces that felt livable and human, built for real people's real lives. He hired 2 young architects from Georgia Tech's College of Design in September. Sharp, earnest, full of the kind of careful ambition he recognized from his own early years. He liked having them around. He liked the energy of a small studio where everyone was trying to make something good. And alongside the architecture, something else began to grow. Without a plan, without an announcement, in the quiet, organic way that necessary things sometimes take shape. Blaise began meeting with other men navigating divorce, men who had given too much for too long in marriages that had taken everything and given back silence. Men in their 40s and 50s who had arrived at the far end of a long relationship with confusion and grief and the specific disorientation of a person who no longer knows who they are outside of a role that has been taken from them. He had no formal organization. He simply offered what he himself had never had, someone across the table, steady and honest, willing to say, "Your experience is real. There is life after this. You are not invisible. You were only in a room that had stopped seeing you. Walk out. You will be seen." The men he met began calling their informal gatherings the clearinghouse. Word spread the way quiet, necessary things tend to person, through trust rather than advertising. And slowly, not all at once, not in any dramatic arc, Blaise King's life stopped feeling like the aftermath of something lost. It started feeling like the beginning of something earned. And what that beginning looked like, for Blaise, for Zuri, and for the man who discovered that the best chapters of his life had been waiting just past the worst night of it, is exactly where this story ends. October came to Lake Wynyard the way October comes to the Georgia foothills. Quietly, almost apologetically, the trees releasing their leaves one by one until the water reflected a whole world of gold and rust and amber that looked nothing like summer and everything like something better. Blaise sat on the screened porch of the cabin on a Saturday afternoon, feet propped up, a cup of coffee balanced on the armrest of his chair, watching the last light move across the water. From inside, he could hear Zuri's voice, bright, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone who has recently discovered strong opinions, explaining to a friend on the phone why the author of a certain novel had gotten a key detail completely wrong, and how she intended to address this in writing. She sounded like a person who had decided, somewhere in the past year, that her perspective was worth expressing. Blaise smiled at the ceiling. He had worried about her, the way fathers worry, which is to say, constantly and at hours that have no names. Zuri had started seeing a therapist in Gainesville not long after she moved to the cabin, a perceptive woman who had managed, over many Wednesday afternoons, to give an 11-year-old girl a vocabulary for things she had been carrying in silence for far too long. She was doing well. Not perfectly, not in the clean, easy way that makes for a tidy story, but in the honest, forward-moving way that actual healing works. A few months earlier, she had asked Blaise if she could visit her mother. He said yes without a pause. "She's still your mother," he told her. "That doesn't change, and as you get older, you get to decide how much space you want to give that relationship. That is your choice to make, not mine." Zuri had thought about it. Then she looked at him and said,
"I just wanted to make sure you weren't sad about it."
He pulled her in and held on a beat longer than usual. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You're going to be something." She had visited Zara twice since then. Short visits, careful ones. Zara was working at a non-profit consultancy in Midtown, living simply, in therapy herself, doing the slow, unglamorous work of understanding who she was without the external scaffolding of titles and wealth and other people's admiration holding her upright. Blaise didn't ask for details. He didn't track her progress or wish for her failure. When he thought of Zara at all, he felt something he could only describe as a mild and permanent sorrow. Not for what was lost, but for what the two of them had never fully allowed themselves to become. He had forgiven her, not as a declaration, not as a performance of virtue, as a private act of setting something down that he had been carrying too long. Not because it was light, but because his hands had finally grown tired enough to let it go. Forgiveness, he had come to understand, was not a door back into what had broken. It was a door out of the room where you kept returning to relive it. He had walked through that door. He had no intention of walking back. The architectural practice was growing in the unhurried, solid way that Blaise preferred things to grow. The two young architects he had hired in September were settling in well, learning not just technique, but the philosophy of building spaces that serve the people inside them rather than impressing the people looking at them from the outside. He was teaching them both, architecture and something harder to name, something about steadiness, about the difference between ambition that builds and ambition that consumes. The clearinghouse had grown as well, still informal, still driven entirely by word of mouth, but the circle of men had widened and the conversations had deepened, and more than once Blaise had sat across from someone and recognized in that person's eyes the same specific exhaustion he had once seen in his own mirror. The look of a man who had given everything to a room that had stopped acknowledging he was there. He told them the same thing every time, in different words. "You are not the problem. You were simply in the wrong room. Walk out, build something. You will be seen." On the porch, the coffee had gone slightly cool. A great blue heron stood motionless at the water's edge 30 yards off, That magnificent, patient stillness that suggests the world is in no particular hurry and the right thing will arrive when it chooses. Blaise watched it for a while. He was 41 years old. He had a daughter who had chosen him. He had work he believed in. He had a porch and a lake and the October light going gold across the water and the sound of his child's laughter drifting through the screen door. He had stopped waiting for the life he had imagined. He had recognized the one he was already living. That was the whole of it. That was more than enough. This story leaves behind 4 quiet, practical truths, the kind worth writing on a note card and tucking inside a kitchen cabinet door. 1. If the person you love has stopped asking how your day went, not once, not twice, but for months, that silence is data. Don't explain it away. Name it, to yourself, clearly and honestly. Denial is not loyalty. It is just delayed pain. 2. Blaise didn't protect himself the night everything fell apart. He protected himself 16 months before that night, by keeping records, maintaining his own accounts, and documenting what he hoped he'd never need. If you are in a long marriage and something quietly feels wrong, call your own attorney before you call your best friend. Information is the kindest gift you can give yourself. 3. What Zara mistook for love was simply someone making her feel extraordinary at low cost to himself. Before trusting a feeling that arrived suddenly and intensely, ask one honest question. What does this person actually stand to gain? The answer will tell you almost everything. 4. Children remember the parent who stayed at the table, not the speeches, not the gifts. The one who showed up on the ordinary Tuesday with nothing remarkable to offer except their full, unhurried presence. That parent is never forgotten. That is the whole lesson. Blaise King did not lose his marriage and fall apart. He survived it. And then, one ordinary Saturday afternoon, on a porch by a lake, with gold light on the water and his daughter laughing inside and a heron standing perfectly still at the shoreline, he began. The soul of these stories comes from human experience, empathy, and courage. AI assisted only in language refinement, so that timeless lessons of justice, compassion, and standing up against wrong could move and educate viewers everywhere. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.